Hey everybody out there, my name is Dragnix, and I set my critical eye today on Brutal. Brutal brings ASCII related dungeon exploring to the PlayStation 4 on August 9th, 2016 for $14.99. I played the game for about 6 hours, and did about 8 different runs during that time. Here's the question, what will be more brutal? The difficulty of this dungeon crawler, as you get the thrills of the game throwing every symbol on a standard keyboard at you. Or will you feel the brutality of poor gameplay design, as the game feels like a relic of the old games that it is imitating? That's what I'm here to find out, but before I begin, this key was obtained via keymailer via the developer for the purposes of review. That won't change my opinion of the game in the end, but you should know that because of FTC guidelines, as well as the whole morals thing, you know? Let's start with the most striking element of the game, its presentation. And it's a unique one at that. Rather than completely mimic the gameplay and the ASCII graphics of the really old dungeon crawlers, Brutal took those elements and created a 3D world that feels entirely fresh and new. The elements of your standard WASD keyboard are worked into the presentation, and it's not just ham-fisted in there to keep the theme. For example, the keys smartly use symbols like the $sign to give the items its detail and its definition. The art design team deserves a lot of credit here, as it used everything it could to really make for a game that's really lovely to look at. Look, it may not be cutting edge graphics, but it does stand out as one of the best art directions for a game that I've played in a while. Now the game keeps its color palette simple in the regular gameplay, primarily focusing on the white line definitions against the black background. It makes for a striking and defined presentation, keeping everything simple yet clean. And yes, you can insert your Kingdom Hearts joke here. Now the game is not just black and white as you've already seen, but everything is done with 1 or 2 base colors per item. With the exception of the loot in the game, colors usually represent elemental damage types in the game, such as the orange of fire or bright green for poison. In particular with the weapons, it's complemented with small effects like small lightning bolts when attacking, adding a small yet smart detail to help that simple presentation. The use of different effects is what really stands out here. The green mist of a poison cloud, despite its simple presentation, really looks striking when compared to the sleek background in question. This is a game about functional style in most cases, and frankly, a lot of games can learn from this execution. Style is great in games, but when your gameplay suffers because of it, then you've gone too far. Brutal understands this, and uses the KISS principle to really drive home the presentation here. Now that I've said that, the only problem that I really have with the visual presentation has to do with the AI, surprisingly. A lot of the major melee enemies will run at you at the same time. And if there's multiple enemies with elemental effects that end up running at you, things can get hard to see. Like really hard to see. I'll get more into this within the gameplay section of this video, but when trying to block attacks in this scenario, it can be really hard to see for timing purposes. Moving on from the visuals, let's talk about the music. The music is just plain weird, because I'm not exactly sure I can say that this game has traditional music. Oh sure, you've got beats that start playing with a solid drum beat coming in when you enter a room. But then, it disappears just as soon as it came at times. It's so strange and so inconsistent. The game attempts to use the music elements to help point out action before returning back to your normal, creepy, and mysterious dungeon ambiance noise. But it's so jarring at times when the music comes and goes, as I felt like someone was behind me with a remote control, turning on and off speakers over and over and over again. It sorta pissed me off, and it didn't help that I didn't have control over it option-wise. Now, it's not like the music here is bad of any sort, but it's the arrangement of it that really bothers me. Take a listen to see what I'm talking about. This leads me to the sound design and elements as a whole. The game is a lot stronger in this case, as the sounds of your warrior grunting as he breaks the 3000 crate that he's run across are clear and effective. The small ping when you grab a piece of loot, or the sizzle that happens when you run across the poison floor, everything worked for creating an atmosphere of being stuck in a dungeon trying to kill you at every turn. Once again, take a listen of exactly what I'm talking about, but know this, the sound design is on point here. As for the performance, the game is mostly there. Once in a while, I did see the game stutter, like it was attempting to keep up with the action, and someone paused the game and moved it a second forward. Now this is a rare occurrence, and in fact, it almost helps the presentation in giving it a VHS-like effect to it. I didn't really experience any slowdown within the main combat, which is probably the most important aspect of this performance. Load times can be long at times, especially when you first boot up the game. It takes about 20 to 30 seconds for it to get to the main menu, and that's a little bit surprising considering the lack of load times within the actual gameplay. But let's move on to the actual meat behind these symbols, the gameplay. As I mentioned earlier, this is a 3D dungeon crawler, and your goal is simply to get to the end of the dungeon and kill the guardian of the dungeon. The game doesn't really explain why you need to do this. Did the Guardian do something wrong? Is the dungeon inherently evil? Does the dungeon have Girl Scout cookies at the end of it? No idea. If you need story within your gameplay, Brutal is not a game you should be looking at. You start the game at the highest level of the dungeon, and your goal in each level is to find materials and equipment to help you along the way, while finding the hole to the next floor. You'll run across locked doors and traps, as well as many of the dungeon inhabitants trying to kill you. Because no dungeon would be complete without a series of creatures that want to kill you. It's a standard in the dungeon real estate industry. Now while there's 4 classes from you to choose from for each run, it's really just a different set of opening skills that are allocated to each of them. You've got a mage that focuses on ranged attacks and the use of mana from the get-go, to the warrior who focuses on health and strength at first. But it's not like the warrior can't unlock the mage skill tree when he levels up, and vice versa. Also, don't get too attached to your character, as this game has permadeath, although you can find lives within dungeons to help extend your runs. The hallways here are procedurally generated in terms of layout and item distribution based on a seed, and it's pretty extensive in terms of organizing those elements into different dungeon variations. For example, there was a run where I literally found no weapons at all, even as I had gotten 10 levels deep into the dungeon. My Amazon ended up turning into Rocky Balboa, as I desperately looked for any sort of weapon to help keep the enemies at bay. This did help in making some runs feel reasonably unique at times, as I had to rely on what the game was giving me in this run. Now, this wasn't necessarily that common. Most of the runs felt the same after playing through them for 30 minutes or so, and only really ended up feeling different depending on if I got to a new max floor or not. The game does its best to organize the elements into different layouts, as I mentioned before, but at some point, it just doesn't have enough different elements to shuffle up. In terms of enemy layout, the enemies you face are pretty standard from floor to floor, so don't expect variety there from the long haul. I sort of wish that the game had more oomph in this area, maybe mixing more of the later game enemies into the floors earlier on, at a weaker strength and health. Now your character is going through a dungeon, and you'll have to take care of his or her needs. In particular, hunger. If your character doesn't eat, they'll be horribly weakened, so keeping up their strength is essential. With that said, I found the hunger mechanic to really not have a huge influence in the long run of the game. Maybe the 8 or so runs that I did just never created the specific condition that forced me to really ration out my food. But I sit here thinking that the hunger mechanic was tacked on in the end, that it didn't necessarily exist within the original gameplay design. To be quite honest, I think the game would be better without it. It just feels like unnecessary fluff. And now, after 10 minutes of talking, I finally get to the combat section of Brutal. Brutal's combat relies on simplicity. There's no complicated combos here. You've got one melee attack and a simple combo to go with it. Granted, the combo is reliant on any weapon that you're using in terms of speed and damage, but it really doesn't change up the combat in any sort of significant way. That's due to your ability to break out of the combo by jumping and or dodging. You do have a special attack depending on your skill set as well, but the main combo in combat was so effective, I rarely used it. If I remember, I had it. Now, ranged combat wise, you start with your shield. Your shield is a boomerang as well, and it's apparently got some darn good aerodynamics. Now, depending on your skill set, you may have a mana attack, as well as the ability to shoot a bow, which gets a charge shot along with it. But to be clear, I found the ranged combat to be very situational as opposed to building around it. I only really used it to exploit the AI deficiencies when I really felt like doing it. Back to the shield. You can block to reduce incoming damage, but time it just right and you'll entirely negate the damage. Now, while that system is functional and effective, as I'll allude to in a bit, it paled compared to other strategies. Again, this was a very situational use. Now, as you progress in the dungeon, you'll run across weapon blueprints, which can be created with the letters that you find along the way. And I mean literally, it's made with the letters that you find. That's actually really cool from a design perspective. You can also enchant these weapons with various statuses if you happen to have a colored letter that the weapon uses. A weapon can be enchanted with multiple effects, and you can switch between these effects within combat by hitting the appropriate directional control with the quick item menu. These elements have your typical standard elements in the dungeon crawling genre: fire, ice, poison, and you can exploit enemy weaknesses based off it. Okay, with a good amount of the core mechanics explained, how's Brutal's gameplay as a whole? Well, the core of a roguelike dungeon crawler is here, and the game has a strong start in the first few hours. As you get used to exploring the dungeon and finding items for the first time, the game definitely draws you in and can be addictive, especially given its unique presentation. There's something about the simplicity and focus on the dungeon exploration that does work at a core level here, and that's part of the reason why the genre works as a whole. When you see something new, you definitely want to explore it, but you're also cautious as it could end up burning some precious resources in order to do it. And from a simple level perspective, the combat does work again at first. A new enemy will give you a challenge, and you'll learn that there's good ways and bad ways to go about dealing with different enemy types. Thanks to the presentation, the audio and visuals of combat is pleasing, and while part of the combat can feel button mashy, skilled warriors will get the most out of the use of blocking and dodging. But notice how I said at first. Part of the issue regarding Brutal has to do with the lack of variety over time and the difficulty of the game. Dungeon crawlers as a whole are known for their brutality, and you'd expect that Brutal would continue that legacy given its namesake. But compared to others in the genre, Brutal is well on the easier side of things. That definitely goes for the co-op portion of the game as well, which didn't seem to adjust things based on the second player. While combat had some chaotic moments at times, I didn't really feel threatened. Part of this had to do with the AI, which didn't exactly have the capability of advanced tactics. Sure, some enemies had patterns that you had to deal with, but 95% of the time, I relied on one killer strategy that always seemed to save me. That strategy was acting like a Mexican jumping bean hopped up on Adderall. Enemies just really couldn't deal with the use of that jump. You could exploit it on a regular basis, and your speed compared to your enemies meant that they could keep up with you but never overtake you. Sure, you would take a hit now and again using the strategy, but usually at the cost of getting 5 to 6 hits on an enemy during that time. Yes, you could avoid that hit going slower, but the game really didn't require it, unless you were planning to go for a long run. In fact, most of the issues that I ran into in the game was mostly self-caused. For example, my inability to ignore mysterious elements and causing myself a lot of pain because of it. In the game, you can make potions, and you don't know what these potions do at first. They are identified by color, and each color and its effects are randomized on every new run. The red potion this run could be a vitality potion, or it could be a potion of poison. So it's a bit of a gamble when you don't know what it is, and you could end up throwing it at an enemy or drinking it yourself. I like the mechanic as a whole, and it really could have enhanced the gameplay if I got into a panic situation and had nothing but the potion left, hoping that luck went my way. However, I think that's where Brutal fell a bit short for me. In these dungeon crawlers, I want to have that moment where my back is against the wall. That moment where I overcome everything the game threw at me and got through it by the skin of my teeth. Unfortunately for Brutal, I never really had those moments. Brutal for me was more about the slow burn. You take some damage here, you take a hit there, and over time it starts to wear. Now granted, if you're exploring enough of the map, you won't really have problems at first, as there's plenty of food and items to pick up. But eventually, the momentum of enemies and the lack of items will start to overwhelm you, and then you'll bleed out. That slow burn works in several ways, but because of the lack of variety over the long haul, it can be boring during that process. But despite that, the game somehow was still addictive. Despite not enjoying the combat at a certain point and wondering if the game had anything left to show me, I still wanted to keep playing, even if I was bored at that moment. I can't describe it. It has that X factor of roguelikes, ones where you want to keep going even if you know what's coming up. Kudos to the game, despite its flaws. With that said, you may wonder what the biggest threat of the game is. Could it be the killer spiders? Werewolves? How about the big ogres that come at you? Nope. The biggest threat that the game presents is its platforming. Of the overall runs I did, 6 out of the 8 ended with me jumping to my death. It's not that the controls are bad here, but sometimes the placement of the platforms can come as a surprise, or even be tricky in terms of placement. You need to play slowly here, but the thing is, after you've played the first dungeon 8 times, you'll want to rush, and then you'll fall to your death. One last thing before my conclusion. Something about the menus in this game gave me problems. I think it has everything to do with the D-pad and control stick implementation. You'll navigate the menus via the left control stick, and you'll assign quick items via the D-pad. But in the menus, there's sometimes this weird delay on the control stick. This ends up making you use the D-pad, and then accidentally assigning something. I really wish that the default option here was the D-pad for menu navigation, and that in order to assign a new D-pad within combat, that a secondary button like R1 was used. In the end, Brutal's biggest strength is its presentation, and the core of the genre is here in the dungeon crawler with some of its simple combat and exploration gameplay. It does have that addictive quality to it, and for those who are willing to leg out the long haul of this game, you get a really unique game for $15. But for those huge dungeon crawler enthusiasts out there, Brutal may not be able to keep your attention, as a lack of content over time may do you in, and there's a lot better combat within dungeon crawlers out there. I do recommend picking up Brutal at some point, but for those veterans of the genre, I may suggest waiting for a sale. But as always, I'm only one reviewer despite my dedication to objectivity and playing in different ways. For different opinions, I'd check OpenCritic for different reviews. In particular, go check out Sam's review over at TechRaptor as well. Anyway, this is Dragnix signing out, really wondering if ASCII art is making a return in the gaming world. I'll see you next time with my critical eye on Headlander. Thanks for watching. Like the video, share it with a friend, and subscribe if you want more content like this. In the description below, you'll find the Steam review accompanying this vid, along with social media that you can follow me on, Twitter, Google+, and Facebook groups. And if you want to support the channel, click that Patreon on the left of the screen. And remember, keep on gaming.